He was a genius of attack, a commander whose operations were included in military textbooks. His armies surrounded the enemy at Stalingrad, stood their ground at Kursk, and liberated Kiev. He was called a Grand Master and a master of surprise attacks. But he did not meet his death on the battlefield at the hands of enemy soldiers. A fatal bullet struck him deep behind enemy lines in a random ambush, giving rise to one of the greatest mysteries of the Great Patriotic War. Who was General Vatutin? The architect of great victories, or the victim of a fatal accident and betrayal? Today we will tell the story of a general who won all his major battles, but lost the last one, the battle with death. History knows many examples when, at the turning point of an era, people who seemed completely unsuited for great deeds come to the fore. Nikolai Fedorovich Vatutin, future army general and one of the most talented commanders of the Great Patriotic War, was just such a person. He was born on December 19, 1901, in the small village of Chepukino in the Voronezh province, into a large and poor peasant family. His world was one of hard labor on the land, a world where the horizon was limited to the surrounding area and the church parish. It seemed that fate had prepared a path for him, trodden by generations of his ancestors. Work from dawn to dusk, a modest existence, a life inextricably linked to the cycles of nature. But the 20th century burst into this patriarchal way of life with a hurricane of change. The revolution and the civil war that followed split the country and mixed all social classes. For many, it was a tragedy, but for young, ambitious, and energetic people from the lower classes, such as Nikolai Vatutin, it was a once-in-a-thousand-years opportunity. In April 1920, as a 19-year-old young man, he voluntarily joined the ranks of the Red Army. This was not the impulse of a revolutionary romantic, but rather a conscious choice of a path that promised a way out of the hopeless rural routine. He was assigned to the 192nd Rifle Regiment and almost immediately found himself in the heat of battle. He was baptized in battle against Nestor Makhno's troops and then against the UNR gangs near Poltava and Lugansk. It was here, in the chaos and cruelty of civil strife, that his character was formed. He quickly realized that war was not only about bravery and self-sacrifice, but also a harsh science requiring knowledge and discipline. Unlike many self-taught commanders of the time, Vatutin intuitively sought knowledge. He understood that a saber and a revolver were not enough to win a modern war. After the war, he did not demobilize, but firmly decided to devote his life to the army. His first step on the path to military education was the Poltava Infantry School, which he graduated from in 1922. This was only the beginning. Vatutin studied practically his entire life, with a persistence and methodical approach that would later become his trademark. In 1924, he graduated from the Kiev Higher Combined Military School, and then, realizing that he lacked fundamental knowledge, he entered the most prestigious military educational institution in the country, the Frunze Military Academy. He studied in the same group as future marshals and generals, but even among them he stood out for his analytical mind, phenomenal memory, and incredible work ethic. He did not simply memorize regulations and tactical schemes. He absorbed the fundamentals of operational art, striving to understand the very logic of combat and operations. His graduation thesis was devoted to the complex topic of organizing a breakthrough of a fortified defensive line. Even then, within the walls of the academy, he began to lay the theoretical foundation for the most rapid and profound offensive operations that would later make his name famous. In 1937, he graduated with honors from the first class of the General Staff Academy, an elite educational institution created to train the highest command personnel of the Red Army. From a peasant boy whose lot was to plow the land, he became one of the most educated and promising commanders of his time. This path from the plow to the academic badge was not achieved by chance or patronage, but solely through his own perseverance, willpower, and insatiable thirst for knowledge. This foundation, laid in peacetime, would enable him to survive the hardest days of the war and become a true architect of future victories. The end of the 1930s was a paradoxical and ominous time for the Red Army. On the one hand, there was active rearmament and the development of new advanced military theories, such as the theory of deep operations. The army was turning into a powerful mechanized force. On the other hand, the sword of Damocles hung over the command staff in the form of repression. The year 1937 went down in history as the year of the Great Terror, which decapitated the army, destroying thousands of the most experienced commanders. Surviving and, moreover, making a career in such an environment required not only professionalism, but also enormous caution and, at times, luck. Vatutin was lucky. His peasant background, lack of connections with the old officer corps, and impeccable reputation as a workaholic and talented staff officer made him virtually immune to purges. While others fell victim to the NKVD, he rose rapidly through the ranks, filling vacant positions. Immediately after graduating from the General Staff Academy, he was sent to the Siberian Military District as Chief of Staff. But Siberia was too far from the center of decision-making and from the potential theater of war. The real springboard for his career was in the west of the country. In 1938, he was transferred to the Kiev Special Military District, the most powerful and well-equipped in the Red Army. At first, he served as Chief of Staff of the district, and then, after a short assignment, as First Deputy Chief of Staff to the renowned commander Georgy Zhukov. Working in Kiev was an invaluable learning experience for Vatutin. Here, on the Western Front, he put into practice what he had previously studied in theory. He was not just a desk strategist, but the brain center of a huge military organism. He was responsible for mobilization planning, combat training of troops, and the development of operational plans in case of war. He spent days on end poring over maps, calculating possible enemy actions and the Red Army's response. It was during this period that his talent as an innovative staff officer fully blossomed. He had a unique ability to see real troops, terrain, and logistical chains behind the lines on the map. His memory was phenomenal. He remembered the names and locations of hundreds of units, the names of commanders, and the tactical and technical characteristics of weapons. Zhukov, known for his demanding and tough nature, quickly recognized the exceptional abilities of his chief of staff. Despite their different personalities, the expressive and authoritative Zhukov and the calm and methodical Vatutin, they formed an effective team. Vatutin knew how to translate Zhukov's strategic ideas into clear orders and directives, ensuring that they reached every person responsible for their implementation. He was a master of staff culture, a man capable of making the huge and complex mechanism of the headquarters run like clockwork. In 1940, Vatutin was taken to Moscow, to the General Staff, to the position of head of the Operations Directorate. This was a key unit responsible for planning all military operations. In effect, he became one of the Soviet Union's chief military strategists. Soon after, in February 1941, he was appointed First Deputy Chief of the General Staff for Operational Matters and Rear Services. At the age of only 39, he held one of the highest positions in the country's military hierarchy. In this position, he was directly involved in the development of the considerations on the strategic deployment of the armed forces of the Soviet Union in the event of war with Germany. This plan, which became the subject of fierce debate among historians, called for a preemptive strike against German troops. However, history decided otherwise. All this titanic staff work, all these plans and calculations would soon be tested by the fire of the most terrible war in human history. The dawn of June 22, 1941, forever divided the country's history into before and after. For General Vatutin, as for millions of his compatriots, it was the beginning of the most terrible ordeal of his life. Despite all the plans and considerations, the Wehrmacht's attack was sudden and devastating. Airstrikes, artillery fire, and avalanches of tank divisions descended on Soviet troops, catching them in the process of deployment. Carefully crafted plans collapsed in the first hours of the war. Communications were disrupted, and command of the troops was lost. In this situation of total chaos and uncertainty, Vatutin was sent to one of the most threatened sectors, the Northwestern Front, as Chief of Staff. It was a step from the quiet of the General Staff's offices into the very heart of the disaster. The Northwestern Front, covering the Baltic states and the approaches to Leningrad, took the brunt of the attack by the powerful Army Group North. The front's troops were weaker than in other border districts and found themselves in a desperate situation. The retreat was rapid and bloody. Entire divisions and corps were surrounded, died in cauldrons, or scattered under the blows of German aviation. For Vatutin, it was a cruel lesson. All his academic training and staff experience collided with the harsh reality of the Blitzkrieg. He saw cities burning, endless columns of refugees stretching along the roads, and his soldiers and commanders dying. He went without sleep for days, trying to restore command, gather scattered units, and organize at least some kind of defense. He personally went to the front lines, under bullets and shells, to assess the situation on the ground, coordinate between units, and encourage demoralized commanders with his presence. It was here, in the heat of battle, that one of the main traits of his character emerged: an unyielding will and coolness in the most critical situations. He did not succumb to the panic that gripped many. His mind continued to work clearly and analytically, looking for a way out of a seemingly hopeless situation. Together with the front commander, General Kuznetsov, they tried to organize counterattacks to slow down the enemy's advance. The most famous of these was the counterattack near Soltsi in mid-July, where Soviet troops managed to temporarily stop and even repel Manstein's 56th Motorized Corps. It was a small tactical victory against the backdrop of a huge strategic defeat, but it had enormous moral significance. It showed that the Germans could be beaten. It provided invaluable experience in organizing counterattacks under conditions of enemy air superiority. Vatutin learned important lessons from this operation, which he would later apply on a much larger scale. However, the front was unable to stop the German advance on Leningrad. The losses were monstrous. Vatutin took this tragedy very personally, blaming himself for what was happening. He realized that the war that had begun on June 22nd was not the war they had prepared for. It was a war for survival, requiring completely different approaches, superhuman effort, and enormous sacrifices. The bitter experience of retreat and defeat in the summer of 1941 tempered him, turning him from a theorist into a practitioner of war. He learned to make tough but necessary decisions, to act under conditions of time and information shortages. And, most importantly, he did not break down. This experience would become the foundation on which he would build future victories. He remembered this lesson forever. Underestimating the enemy and losing control of your troops leads to disaster. By the winter of 1941, the Wehrmacht's military machine, which had seemed invincible, began to falter. The Blitzkrieg had failed. The advance on Moscow was halted by the heroic resistance of the Red Army and the harsh Russian frosts. A period of relative stability on the front began, and the Supreme Command headquarters began to prepare countermeasures. At this critical moment, Vatutin's experience and analytical mind were once again in demand at the center. He was recalled from the front and returned to Moscow, to the General Staff. It was not just a return to familiar surroundings. Now, he came here not as a theorist, but as a commander who had experienced firsthand the full force of the German blow and the bitterness of defeat. His appointment as Chief of Staff of the Northwestern Direction, and then his work in the General Staff as one of the leading developers of operations, marked a new stage in his career. He became part of the collective brain of the army that, under the most difficult conditions, sought ways to turn the tide of the war. The work in the General Staff in the winter of 1941 to 1942 was titanic. It was a round-the-clock marathon. Vatutin worked closely with the Chief of the General Staff, Boris Shaposhnikov, and his deputy, Alexander Vasilevsky. This triumvirate of outstanding staff officers became the core of the Soviet Union's strategic planning. Shaposhnikov, the patriarch of the General Staff, had vast experience and strategic intuition. Vasilevsky was a brilliant organizer and analyst. Vatutin brought to this team fresh frontline experience, bold thinking, and incredible stamina. He could work tirelessly for hours on end, analyzing intelligence data, mapping the situation, and proposing bold, unconventional solutions. He was often called upon to report to Stalin. The Supreme Commander, who valued competence and business acumen above all else in people, quickly singled out Vatutin. He saw in him not just an executor, but a man capable of thinking big and defending his point of view, even if it differed from that of his superiors. Vatutin was directly involved in planning the winter counteroffensive near Moscow and subsequent operations across the entire Soviet-German front. He was one of the authors of the plan to encircle the enemy's Demyansk group, one of the first successful operations of its kind. Although it was not possible to completely destroy the Demyanka cauldron at that time, this operation provided invaluable experience and showed that the Red Army had learned not only to defend itself, but also to carry out complex offensive operations to encircle the enemy. Work in the General Staff required not only military but also diplomatic talents. Vatutin had to interact with front commanders, often ambitious and headstrong individuals, convince them of the advisability of one decision or another, and coordinate the actions of various fronts. He proved himself a master of compromise, able to find common ground with a wide variety of people, from Zhukov to Rokossovsky. However, despite its enormous importance, office work weighed heavily on Vatutin. His active nature yearned for the front, where the fate of the country was being decided and where his plans could be translated into real military action. He felt that his true calling was not so much to develop plans as to implement them. This opportunity would present itself in the summer of 1942, when a new grand battle would unfold on the southern flank of the Soviet-German front, leading him to the banks of the Volga and his first great triumph. His time in the General Staff was the last step before he jumped to the top of the military leadership. Here, he finally became a strategist who could think in terms of fronts and armies, and was ready to take full responsibility for the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The summer of 1942 brought new trials for the Red Army. After the failure of the offensive on Kharkov and the disaster in Crimea, the Wehrmacht launched a powerful offensive in the south, seeking to capture the Caucasian oil fields and cut off the Volga, the country's most important transport artery. The main target of this offensive was the city of Stalingrad. It was here, on the banks of the Great Russian River, that a battle unfolded that became a turning point in the entire Second World War. And Nikolai Vatutin was destined to become one of the main architects of this victory. In July 1942, his dream came true. He left the General Staff and was appointed commander of the new Voronezh Front. But his moment of glory was yet to come. In October, when fierce street fighting was raging in Stalingrad itself, the High Command began preparing a grandiose counter-offensive operation codenamed Uranus. The plan was bold and risky, to deliver powerful blows to the flanks of the Germans. Group, which were covered by weaker Romanian and Italian troops, break through their defenses and join forces in the area of Kalachna-Donu, encircling General Paulus's entire 6th Field Army in a giant cauldron. To accomplish this task, a new southwestern front was created, and Stalin appointed General Vatutin as its commander. This was a huge vote of confidence and a tremendous responsibility. Vatutin was to deliver the main blow of the entire operation. He threw himself into his work. Together with representatives of the High Command, Vasilevsky and Zhukov, he finalized the details of the plan, conducted reconnaissance, and assessed the strength of the enemy and the capabilities of his own troops. Vatutin proved himself not only as a talented planner, but also as a master of camouflage and deception. The transfer of huge numbers of troops, tank corps, artillery divisions, infantry, to their starting positions was carried out in the strictest secrecy, mainly at night. Until the last moment, the Germans had no idea of the strike of such force that was being prepared. They expected the attacks to continue in Stalingrad itself, but not a powerful flanking strike. The morning of November 19, 1942, began with a deafening artillery barrage. Thousands of guns and mortars rained down on the positions of the Romanian troops. Immediately afterwards, tank and mechanized corps of the Southwestern Front rushed into the breach. The enemy's defenses, unable to withstand such pressure, collapsed. Vatutin's tanks rushed deep into the enemy's defenses, bypassing pockets of resistance and destroying rear areas and headquarters. This was the very deep strike, whose theory he had studied so carefully in the academies. Now he was putting it into practice. His troops acted swiftly and decisively. The 25th Tank Corps played a key role in the success, covering more than 120 kilometers in a few days and reaching Kalash. On November 23rd, in the area of the Soviet farmstead, the advance units of Vatutin's Southwestern Front joined forces with units of General Eremenko's Stalingrad Front. The encirclement was complete. More than 300,000 men were trapped in the cauldron. This was a disaster for the Wehrmacht, from which it never recovered. Operation Uranus was a triumph of Soviet military art and a personal triumph for General Vatutin. He proved that he was not just a competent staff officer, but an outstanding commander capable of independently planning and conducting the most complex strategic operations. His name resounded throughout the country. From the shadows of the general staff offices, he stepped onto the stage of history as one of the main architects of the coming victory. The Stalingrad triumph forever inscribed his name in the annals of military history. The triumph at Stalingrad turned the heads of many in the Soviet High Command, including Stalin himself. It seemed that the Wehrmacht had been broken and that the entire southern group of German troops could be defeated with one decisive blow. On the wave of this optimism, the High Command launched Operation Skok, whose goal was to reach the Dnieper River and liberate the Donbass. General Vatutin, commander of the Southwestern Front, was assigned a key role in this operation. However, the euphoria of victory played a cruel joke. The enemy was underestimated. The German command, having recovered from the shock, managed to assemble a powerful tank group under the command of one of the Third Reich's best strategists, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. One of the most dramatic episodes of the war on the Eastern Front began. In January-February 1943, Vatutin's troops continued their offensive and achieved significant successes. During the Ostrogorsk-Rososhanskaya and Voronezh-Kastornenskaya operations, large enemy forces were defeated and hundreds of settlements were liberated. The front's troops advanced hundreds of kilometers and liberated Kharkov. It seemed that final victory in the south was within reach, but this was only an illusion. The troops were exhausted by continuous fighting, communications were stretched, and the rear fell behind. Tank corps suffered heavy losses in equipment, and there was a shortage of fuel and ammunition. Vatutin, who was at the forefront of the offensive, saw this and reported to the High Command on the need to pause, bring up reserves, and consolidate the positions achieved. However, his warnings were ignored. The order was simple: forward. And at that moment, Manstein launched his famous counterattack. Gathering fresh SS tank divisions, he struck the flank and rear of the stretched-out Soviet armies. This came as a complete surprise to Vatutin's troops. A rapid, chaotic retreat began, at times reminiscent of the tragedy of the summer of 1941. The recently liberated Kharkov had to be abandoned again. Entire armies were in danger of being surrounded. Vatutin found himself in a very difficult situation. Stalin's wrath fell upon him, accusing him of losing vigilance and inability to command troops. It was a cruel and largely unjust blow. Vatutin, who had foreseen the danger, now had to clean up a mess that he had not created alone. But he did not lose heart. In this critical situation, he demonstrated his best qualities: composure, determination, and the ability to take a blow. He rushed across the front, restoring command, organizing the defense at intermediate lines, and gathering scattered units into a cohesive force. He managed to prevent the worst: the complete collapse of the front. At the cost of enormous efforts and losses, the retreat was halted at the Seversky Donets River. Here, the front stabilized, forming a salient that would go down in history as the Kursk Bulge. The Kharkov disaster was a severe personal and professional test for Vatutin. It knocked the arrogance of victory out of him and taught him a harsh lesson. In war, you can't underestimate the enemy for a minute, and any success, even the most brilliant, can turn into defeat if you don't stop in time. This experience, paid for with a lot of blood, made him wiser and more cautious. He understood that war is not only about rapid breakthroughs, but also about persistent, methodical work. The ability to switch to defense at the right moment, gather strength, and strike with certainty. He would brilliantly learn this lesson and apply it just a few months later, on the very front lines where his offensive had collapsed. The spring of 1943 brought a temporary lull to the Eastern Front. Both sides, exhausted by the winter campaign, were licking their wounds, pulling up reserves, and preparing for the decisive summer battle. In the center of the Soviet-German front, a huge salient formed, cutting into German positions, the famous Kursk Bulge. The German command, seeking to regain the strategic initiative, developed Operation Citadel. The plan was simple and predictable. Cut off the Kursk salient with powerful converging strikes from the north and south, surround and destroy the Soviet troops there. On the southern face of the Arc, where the main Wehrmacht strike was expected, the Voronezh front, under the command of Nikolai Vatutin, held the defense. After a heavy defeat near Kharkov, he was given a huge responsibility. He had to not only hold out, but also wear down the enemy's best tank divisions in defensive battles, creating conditions for a subsequent counteroffensive. Vatutin and his staff learned all the lessons from past failures. This time, there was no underestimation of the enemy. Soviet intelligence managed to uncover not only the general plan of Operation Citadel, but also its details, the direction of the strikes, the composition of the groups, and even the exact date of the offensive. Armed with this knowledge, Vatutin set about creating a defense system unparalleled in the history of warfare. A deeply echeloned system was built in his sector, consisting of 8 defensive lines extending 150 to 170 kilometers inland. Thousands of kilometers of trenches and communication passages were dug, and hundreds of thousands of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines were laid. Particular attention was paid to the creation of powerful anti-tank areas in the most likely directions of movement of the German Panzerwaffe. Vatutin personally supervised the engineering work, striving to achieve maximum fire density and the correct location of firing points. He turned his front into a veritable fortress, ready to crush any armored armada. The morning of July 5, 1943, began with a preemptive Soviet artillery counterattack. However, it failed to disrupt the German offensive. General Gotha's 4th Panzer Army, which included the elite SS tank divisions Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, equipped with the latest Tiger and Panther tanks, descended on the positions of the Voronezh front. A battle began that would later be called the Fiery Arch. The fighting reached incredible ferocity. The Germans, with their local superiority, slowly, at the cost of enormous losses, dug into the Soviet defenses. Vatutin was at the very center of this hell. His command post was constantly moving, and he was in the most dangerous areas, personally directing the battle. He proved himself a master of defensive warfare. He skillfully maneuvered reserves, transferring tank brigades and anti-tank regiments to threatened areas, plugging gaps in the defense. His decisions were flexible and bold. When the Germans managed to break through the first and second lines of defense, he did not panic, but brought in fresh forces to stop them at the third line. The battle on the southern flank culminated in the famous Battle of Prokhorovka on July 12th. Although its scale and details are still debated by historians, it has become a symbol of the steadfastness of Soviet soldiers. The introduction of Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army into the battle, although it led to huge losses, finally exhausted the offensive momentum of the German tank divisions. By July 16th, Operation Citadel had finally collapsed. The German troops, having lost most of their tanks, were forced to switch to defense. Vatutin had accomplished his task. His front had held. He had exhausted the enemy, bled its best divisions dry, and created all the conditions necessary to move from defense to his favorite type of combat, a swift and crushing offensive. The defeat at Kursk was the beginning of the end for the Wehrmacht. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front finally passed to the Red Army. Immediately after the end of the defensive battle, the High Command began to implement the second part of its grand plan, the transition to a counteroffensive. On the southern flank of the Kursk Bulge, this operation was codenamed Commander Rumyantsev. Once again, the main role was to be played by the troops of the Voronezh Front under the command of General Vatutin and the Steppe Front under the command of General Konev. The aim of the operation was to defeat the enemy's Belgorod-Kharkov group and liberate 2 key cities, Belgorod and Kharkov. Vatutin, who had just endured a grueling defensive battle, enthusiastically set about preparing for his favorite type of combat operation, an offensive. He sought not simply to repel the enemy, but to encircle and destroy its main forces. Vatutin's plan was bold and original. He decided to strike not head-on, but at the junction of 2 German armies, using powerful tank armies to break through. It was a risky but potentially very effective move. Preparations for the operation were carried out in the shortest possible time, but taking into account all the lessons of the past. Thorough reconnaissance was carried out, powerful strike groups were created, and ammunition and fuel reserves were accumulated. Vatutin personally checked the readiness of the troops, visiting divisions and corps. The offensive began on August 3, 1943. After powerful artillery and air preparation, tank armadas rushed into the breach. The enemy's defenses, weakened and exhausted in previous battles, were broken on the first day. Vatutin's troops, using deep strike tactics, rushed forward, bypassing pockets of resistance and destroying the rear. The German command tried to stop the Soviet advance with counterattacks, throwing their last tank reserves into battle, including the same SS divisions that had fought at Prokhorovka. Fierce tank battles unfolded in the Bogodukov and Akhturka areas, but this time the situation was different. Vatutin, having learned from the bitter experience of the spring, skillfully parried all counterattacks. He did not scatter his forces, but concentrated them on the main directions, creating an insurmountable superiority. He skillfully used anti-tank reserves, which cut off German tank wedges from the infantry, condemning them to destruction. On August 5th, troops of the Voronezh and Steppe fronts liberated Belgorod. On the same day, the city of Orel was liberated by troops of the Bryansk front. In honor of this double triumph, the first artillery salute in the history of the war was fired in Moscow. This became a new tradition, marking every major victory of the Red Army. After the liberation of Belgorod, Vatutin's troops continued their relentless advance towards Kharkov. The battles for this major industrial center were extremely fierce. The Germans turned the city into a veritable fortress, but Soviet troops, bypassing Kharkov from the west, threatened to encircle the German garrison. On the night of August 23rd, to avoid another cauldron, the Germans were forced to abandon the city. On that day, Kharkov was finally liberated. Operation Commander Rumyantsev ended in complete victory. Vatutin once again confirmed his reputation as one of the most talented and aggressive offensive commanders of the Red Army. He demonstrated that he was able to learn from his mistakes and brilliantly took revenge for the spring defeat. The victory at Kursk and the liberation of Kharkov opened the way for the Red Army to the left bank of Ukraine, to the Dnieper. For Vatutin, this was the road home, to the places where he had begun his military career and which he now had to liberate. The defeat of German troops on the Kursk Bulge and the successful completion of the Belgorod-Kharkiv operation opened up stunning prospects for the Red Army. Hitler's Eastern Wall, a powerful system of defensive fortifications along the Dnieper River, which German propaganda had declared impregnable, was not yet complete. The High Command made a bold decision, without giving the enemy time to recover, to immediately begin the battle for the Dnieper and prevent the Germans from gaining a foothold on its right bank. The grandiose race to the Dnieper began. Troops from several Soviet fronts, led by the armies of the Voronezh front under the command of General Vatutin, rushed westward. It was a race against time. The retreating German troops employed a scorched earth tactic. They destroyed railways and bridges, poisoned wells, and destroyed everything that could be of use to the advancing forces. But they could no longer stop the Soviet troops. Vatutin's troops, exhausted by previous battles, covered 30 to 40 kilometers a day. Soldiers slept on the march. Equipment worked at full capacity. But everyone understood the importance of the task. They had to reach the Dnieper before the enemy could organize a strong defense there. At the end of September 1943, the advance units of the Voronezh front reached the Dnieper. A majestic and formidable sight met them. A wide, full-flowing river with a high, steep right bank that dominated the terrain. The Germans had managed to take up defensive positions and met any attempt to cross with hurricane fire. The Soviet troops did not have enough standard means of crossing. Vatutin's order was short and clear: to force the Dnieper on the move, using any means at hand. A truly heroic and tragic epic began. Soldiers crossed the river in fishing boats, on homemade rafts made of logs and barrels, and sometimes simply by swimming, holding their weapons and ammunition above their heads. Thousands of people died in the cold September water under fire from German machine guns and mortars. The waters of the Dnieper, according to eyewitnesses, were red with blood. But despite the horrific losses, small groups of brave men reached the right bank and, clinging to tiny patches of land, captured bridgeheads. They dug in, repelling fierce enemy counterattacks, and held out until the main forces arrived. Vatutin and his staff directed this complex operation around the clock. The command post was located in the immediate vicinity of the river. The general understood that success depended on how quickly artillery, tanks, and fresh troops could be transferred to the bridgeheads. He demanded the impossible from his engineers and sappers: to build pontoon and bridge crossings under continuous enemy fire in the shortest possible time. By early October, the troops of the Voronezh Front, soon renamed the First Ukrainian Front, had managed to capture several important bridgeheads to the south and north of Kiev. The most significant of these were Bukrinsky and Lyutezhsky. Reinforcements poured into these bridgeheads in a continuous stream. The battle for the Dnieper was won. The impregnable eastern wall collapsed, lasting less than a month. This victory was achieved at the cost of enormous sacrifices. According to various estimates, the Red Army lost more than 1 million men killed and wounded in the battle for the Dnieper. But its strategic significance was enormous. The liberation of left bank Ukraine and the capture of bridgeheads on the right bank of the Dnieper opened a direct road to the liberation of all of right bank Ukraine and posed a threat to the entire southern group of German troops. Vatutin, paying a terrible price, created a bridgehead for his next, perhaps most brilliant triumph: the liberation of Kiev. By the end of October 1943, the strategic situation on the approaches to the Ukrainian capital was crystal clear. The troops of the First Ukrainian Front, under the command of Nikolai Vatutin, captured two main bridgeheads on the right bank of the Dnieper: the large Bukrin bridgehead south of Kiev and the much smaller Lyutezh bridgehead north of the city. The German command, expecting the main attack to come from the larger and more convenient Bukrin bridgehead, concentrated its main tank and infantry divisions against it. It seemed that the logic of war dictated the only possible scenario: to build up forces on the Bukrin bridgehead and try to break through the German defenses head-on. At first, the command was inclined to choose this option. Two attempts to advance from the Bukrin bridgehead in October ended in failure. The Soviet troops, suffering heavy losses, were unable to break through the enemy's powerful defenses in the rugged terrain, which was unsuitable for tanks. It became clear that a frontal assault would only lead to huge casualties and would not guarantee success. At this critical moment, General Vatutin made one of the most daring and risky decisions of his entire career. He proposed a daring and unconventional plan to the High Command: to secretly transfer the main forces, including General Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army, from the Bukrin bridgehead to the Lyutezhsky bridgehead under cover of night. It was a task of enormous complexity. It was necessary to withdraw an entire tank army from one bridgehead, keep it completely hidden from the enemy, who was constantly monitoring the positions of Soviet troops, ferry it back to the left bank of the Dnieper, march many kilometers north along the front line, and then cross the Dnieper and Desna rivers again to reach the tiny Lyutezh bridgehead. Any mistake or leak of information could have led to disaster. The operation to regroup the troops was a masterpiece of military cunning and camouflage. To deceive the enemy, mock-ups of tanks and guns were left on the Bukrin bridgehead, active radio communications were simulated, and sappers continued to demonstratively build false crossings. Meanwhile, at night, under strict radio silence, thousands of tanks, trucks, and guns moved north. Engineers under enemy fire laid underwater bridges and ferries. On November 1st, when the regrouping was largely complete, Vatutin launched a diversionary attack from the Bukrin bridgehead, finally convincing the Germans that the main offensive would begin there. And on the morning of November 3rd, from the Lyutezh bridgehead, where the enemy did not expect such a powerful blow, the entire might of the First Ukrainian Front descended upon them. The surprise effect was complete. The German defenses were broken, and Rybalko's tank army rushed into the breach. Acting swiftly, the tankers cut off the Kiev-Zhytomyr highway, depriving the Kiev group of its escape routes. The German command was in shock. It realized too late the scale of Vatutin's deception and did not have time to transfer reserves from the north to defend the city. Fighting broke out on the outskirts of Kiev. To avoid encirclement, the Germans began a hasty retreat. On the night of November 6, 1943, Soviet troops entered the city, which had been virtually abandoned by the enemy. the red banner flew once again over the capital of Soviet Ukraine. The liberation of Kiev was not just a major military victory, but also an event of enormous political and moral significance. For General Vatutin, it was his moment of glory, the pinnacle of his military career. He demonstrated not only will and determination, but also strategic flexibility, the ability to think outside the box, deceive and outmaneuver a clever and powerful enemy. The Kiev offensive operation has gone down in the history of military art as an example of bold maneuvering and brilliant camouflage. The liberation of Kiev did not mean the end of the struggle for right-bank Ukraine. The German command, enraged by the loss of such an important strategic point, launched a series of powerful counterattacks in an attempt to repel Vatutin's troops and recapture the city. Field Marshal Manstein once again gathered his best tank divisions and threw them into battle. In November-December 1943, fierce counterattacks unfolded in the area of Zhytomyr, Korostin, and Fastiv. The troops of the First Ukrainian Front, exhausted from previous battles, struggled to hold back the enemy's advance. Vatutin once again had to demonstrate his skill in maneuvering defense, withdrawing his troops from under attack at the right moment, and launching counterattacks against the flanks of the German tank wedges. By the end of December, having repelled all enemy attacks and exhausted the enemy, Vatutin began to prepare a new large-scale offensive operation, the Zhytomyr-Berdyshevskaya. On December 24th, on the eve of Catholic Christmas, his troops went on the offensive, again catching the enemy by surprise. Breaking through the defenses, they rushed southwest, liberating Zhytomyr, Berdychev, and other large cities. As a result of this rapid advance, a deep salient was formed, hanging over the northern flank of the German Army Group South. At the same time, further south, the troops of the Second Ukrainian Front, under the command of General Konev, also advanced far to the west. Between the two Soviet fronts, in the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky area, there was a large group of German troops, about 10 divisions. The High Command and the front commanders saw a unique opportunity to create a new Stalingrad for the enemy. The plan of operation was simple and elegant: to launch counterattacks against the base of the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky salient with Vatutin's troops from the west and Konev's from the east, join forces in the Zvenigorodka area, and close the encirclement. Vatutin, with his characteristic energy, set about implementing this plan. On January 24, 1944, his strike force, which included the 6th Tank Army, launched a powerful attack. Despite desperate German resistance and extremely unfavorable weather conditions, solid mud that turned the roads into swamps, the tankers advanced slowly but steadily. On January 28, in the Zvenigorodka area, Vatutin's tankers met with the advance units of Konev's front. The ring closed. Almost 60,000 German soldiers and officers found themselves in a cauldron. The German command made desperate attempts to unblock the surrounded group. Manstein threw several tank divisions into the battle, which delivered a powerful blow from the outside. At the same time, the surrounded troops attempted to break out from the inside. Fierce fighting began on the outer and inner fronts of the encirclement. Vatutin's troops had to withstand enormous pressure. At times, German tanks managed to break through to within a few kilometers of the encircled troops. But Vatutin, skillfully maneuvering his reserves, managed to hold the front. On the night of February 17th, the encircled group made a last desperate attempt to break through. In a snowstorm, German soldiers mixed together into one huge mass and charged forward. But they were met with heavy fire from Soviet artillery and tanks. The defeat was complete. Only a few managed to escape from the fiery trap. The Korsun-Shevchenko operation ended in a brilliant victory. This was another nail in the coffin of the Third Reich, and further confirmation of Vatutin's military genius. He was at the height of his glory, and it seemed that nothing could stop his victorious march westward. But fate had already prepared a fatal blow for him, which would come not from the front, but from deep behind the lines. While grandiose battles raged on the front lines, another invisible and brutal war was being waged deep behind the advancing Red Army in the liberated territories of western Ukraine. It was a war without a front line, without rules, a war of sabotage, ambushes, and terror. The main force opposing Soviet power in this region was the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, or UPA, which was the military wing of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN. The history of this movement is complex and ambiguous. Created in 1942, the UPA set itself the goal of fighting for an independent Ukrainian state. Its enemies were all those who stood in its way. First the German occupiers, then the Soviet partisans, and with the arrival of the Red Army, the regular Soviet troops and administration. The ideology of the OUN was radical nationalist, and its leaders, in particular Stepan Bandera, did not shy away from cooperating with Nazi Germany to achieve their goals, although these relations were complex and volatile. By the beginning of 1944, when the troops of the First Ukrainian Front liberated most of right-bank Ukraine, the UPA was a serious force. Its units, according to various estimates, numbered tens of thousands of fighters. They knew the terrain well, enjoyed the support of part of the local population, and had an extensive network of hideouts and warehouses with weapons and food. Their tactics were classic guerrilla warfare. They avoided large-scale clashes with regular Red Army units, preferring to operate in small, mobile groups. Their targets were small military convoys, individual officers and soldiers, representatives of the Soviet authorities, activists, teachers, and doctors who had arrived from the eastern regions. They attacked military warehouses, disrupted communication lines, and set up ambushes on roads. To combat the UPA, the Soviet command was forced to divert significant forces, special NKVD units, internal troops, and even army units. But this struggle was extremely difficult. The UPA fighters, whom Soviet propaganda referred to exclusively as bandits or banderites, were elusive. During the day, they could be ordinary peasants, but at night they took up arms and fled to the forest. The situation behind Vatutin's front was particularly tense. The forests and swamps of the Rivne and Volyn regions were crossed by vital communications routes used to supply the advancing armies. Any disruption in this system could have catastrophic consequences. As commander of the front, Vatutin was fully responsible for the security of his rear. He repeatedly demanded that the state security services and internal troops step up the fight against the gangs, but it was not possible to completely eliminate the hidden threat. The nationalist underground was well organized and deeply secretive. Red Army commanders, including the highest ranks, had to observe the strictest precautions when moving through liberated territory. Any trip without adequate security was deadly dangerous. However, in the euphoria of victory and the rapid advance westward, these rules were sometimes disregarded. It seemed that the main danger was out there on the front lines, where German tanks stood, and that nothing serious could happen here in the rear, where Soviet power had already been established. This was a dangerous misconception. An invisible enemy was nearby, waiting and ready to strike at the most unexpected moment. It was this hidden underground war, which was not mentioned in the Sovinform Bureau reports, that prepared the ground for the tragedy that would soon unfold on one of the forest roads of the Rovno region. The threat came from where it was least expected. February 29, 1944. This day, which only comes once every 4 years, was the last in the military career of General Vatutin. In the morning, he left Rivne, where his headquarters were located, and headed for Slavuta to check on the preparations for a new offensive operation and visit the headquarters of the 13th and 60th Armies. It was a normal day, filled with routine front-line work. Vatutin was in a good mood. The brilliant Rivne-Lutsk operation had just ended, and the troops were preparing for a new push south. The general's convoy consisted of only a few vehicles, his personal Willys, a security vehicle, and 2 trucks with a small escort of several soldiers. For a front commander operating in an area active with UPA partisans, this was criminally inadequate security. But, as was often the case, safety rules were ignored. The road ran through dense forests and small villages. In the afternoon, while passing through the village of Milyatin in the Ostrog district of the Rivne region, the general's convoy suddenly came under fire. Automatic weapons and machine guns fired at the vehicles from the windows of village houses and from behind fences. It was a well-organized ambush. It later emerged that this was one of hundreds of UPA units under the command of a local field commander. They were most likely not specifically targeting Vatutin. Their goal was any military convoy, any representative of the Soviet authorities. The general was a chance, but very big catch for them. The first volley riddled the Willys. Vatutin, as befits a true commander, did not lose his composure. He jumped out of the car and, together with his guards, engaged the enemy. A short but fierce firefight ensued. The forces were unequal. The UPA fighters, hidden in houses, had a clear advantage. Vatutin, firing his pistol, tried to organize a defense. At one point, while running to another car, he was wounded. A bullet hit the upper part of his thigh, shattering the bone. Under heavy fire, his guards managed to pull the wounded general out of the line of fire, put him in a car, and escape the ambush. The convoy sped back to Rivne at full speed. On the way, Vatutin was given first aid, and a tourniquet was applied to stop the bleeding. He was conscious, but in severe pain. He did not yet realize the seriousness of his injury. It seemed like a normal wound, one of those that thousands of soldiers receive in war. No one, least of all himself, could have imagined that this bullet, fired from around a corner deep behind enemy lines, would prove fatal. News of the front commander's injury reached Moscow instantly. Stalin was furious. He ordered that everything possible and impossible be done to save the general. The country's best surgeons were sent to Rivne and then to Kiev, where Vatutin had been taken. A long and painful struggle for his life began. Meanwhile, large NKVD forces were sent to the site of the ambush. The village of Milyatin and the surrounding forests were combed. During the punitive operation, dozens of UPA fighters involved in the attack were killed and captured. But it was already impossible to punish the main culprit of the tragedy, the criminal negligence that allowed the front commander to move around practically unguarded in an area teeming with hostile partisans. The fatal bullet had already found its target. The architect of great offensive operations was struck down in the rear in a random skirmish that should never have happened. Immediately after being wounded, General Vatutin was taken to a military hospital in Rivne, and then, on Stalin's personal orders, evacuated to Kiev, to the Central Hospital of the People's Commissariat of Defense. A desperate struggle for his life began, lasting 52 days. The best medical minds of the Soviet Union, led by the chief surgeon of the Red Army, academician Nikolai Burdenko, were called to his bedside. The diagnosis was serious, a gunshot wound through the left femur. However, such a wound, with proper treatment, was not considered fatal. The main danger lay elsewhere. Along with the bullet, particles of earth and pieces of clothing had entered the wound, creating ideal conditions for infection to develop. In the first few days, the general's condition was stable. He underwent surgery, the wound was cleaned, and a cast was applied. It seemed that the crisis had passed, and he was on the mend. He remained informed about the situation at the front, and his comrades came to visit him, including Nikita Khrushchev, who was a member of his front's military council. Vatutin even tried to command his troops directly from his hospital bed, but his strength quickly abandoned him. Soon, his condition began to deteriorate rapidly. His temperature shot up, and he was in severe pain. An examination revealed the worst possible complication: gas gangrene. This was a rapidly developing anaerobic infection that literally devoured tissue. In wartime conditions, without antibiotics, gas gangrene was practically a death sentence. The only chance of survival was immediate high amputation of the leg. Gordenko and a council of doctors offered this option to the general. But according to eyewitnesses, Vatutin categorically refused. "Better to die than be crippled at 43, he allegedly said. For him, an active, energetic man, a commander whose entire life was connected with movement and the army, the thought of losing a leg was unbearable. He believed until the very end that his strong body would overcome the infection. This decision is still debated today. Some historians believe that his refusal to undergo amputation was a personal, fateful choice. Others believe that the doctors, fearing Stalin's wrath in the event of a failed operation, did not show sufficient persistence. There is another tragic aspect to this story, connected with penicillin. This miracle antibiotic, which could have saved the general, had already been discovered and was being used by the Allies. The Soviet Union requested a supply from the US, and the Americans were ready to provide it. But, according to one version, the Soviet side demanded not only the drug itself, but also the complete technology for its production. While bureaucratic negotiations were underway, precious time was lost. According to another, more plausible version, samples of penicillin were delivered to Moscow, but they did not dare to use them on Vatutin, as the drug had not yet been sufficiently studied by Soviet doctors, and its effectiveness against gas gangrene was questionable. The struggle continued, but it was already doomed. Sepsis spread throughout his body. Vatutin was dying before our eyes. He fell into a stupor, raved, and saw maps, attacks, and soldiers. On the night of April 15, 1944, the heart of one of the most talented commanders of the Red Army stopped beating. He did not die on the battlefield, not from a German bullet, but on a hospital bed, the victim of an accidental ambush and a merciless infection. His death was a tragedy, not only for his family and loved ones, but for the entire army. The death of General Vatutin came as a shock to the entire country. A lavish state funeral was held for him in Moscow. His body was buried in Mariinsky Park in Kiev, the city he had liberated and where his life had been cut short. He was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Streets and cities were named after him, including the one where he was born. But behind the official mourning and posthumous honors, difficult and uncomfortable questions remained. How could this have happened? Who is responsible for the death of one of the country's best commanders? Direct responsibility undoubtedly lies with the Ukrainian insurgent army fighters who carried out the attack. For them, Vatutin was a symbol of the enemy army, an occupier, and his elimination was a great success. However, to reduce everything to the actions of the UPA is to simplify the picture. There was also indirect, but no less important, responsibility on the part of those responsible for the safety of the front commander. The fateful trip without proper escort through an area with a high level of partisan activity was a flagrant violation of all instructions. Was it simply negligence, dizziness from success, or something more? Conspiracy theories were quick to emerge. Some suggested that Vatutin's death was not accidental. Others hinted at the hand of Moscow, claiming that Stalin allegedly feared the growing popularity of the talented and independent general and had him eliminated by Ukrainian nationalists. This version, however, does not stand up to scrutiny and is not supported by any documentary evidence. Stalin valued Vatutin and, judging by all available information, was genuinely saddened and angered by his death. Another version suggests possible betrayal within Vatutin's own headquarters, claiming that his route was leaked to UPA fighters. Investigations conducted by the NKVD did not confirm this version, although it cannot be completely ruled out, given the complexity of the situation. The most likely and plausible version remains that of a tragic accident made possible by a disregard for basic safety measures. Vatutin's death was a heavy loss for the Red Army. He was succeeded as commander of the First Ukrainian Front by Marshal Georgy Zhukov. Although this did not stop the victorious advance of the Soviet troops, many military historians agree that with Vatutin's departure, the front's operations lost some of their elegance, boldness, and originality. Vatutin was a true grandmaster of offensive operations, a master of deep strikes and deceptive maneuvers. What is his legacy today? In Soviet historiography, he has firmly established himself in the pantheon of great commanders of the victory, alongside Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Konev. His name was a symbol of military talent and heroism. However, after the collapse of the USSR and Ukraine's independence, his figure became the subject of fierce controversy. For part of Ukrainian society, he remains a symbol of the Soviet occupation, and monuments to him have been repeatedly vandalized. His opponents from the UPA, on the contrary, are glorified as heroes. The story of General Vatutin is not just the story of one man's life and death. It is a snapshot of an entire era, tragic, heroic, and full of contradictions. He was a son of his time, a product of the Soviet system, which gave him, a peasant boy, the opportunity to rise to the very top, and which, in the end, failed to protect him. The architect of great victories on the front lines was defenseless against a random bullet in the rear, leaving behind not only the glory of his battles, but also the unsolved mystery of his death.